Hello and welcome everyone to this webinar about the Austrian elections to the National Parliament. My name is Mesut Sini from think tank EUROPA here in Copenhagen, and I will be moderating the discussion today. So on September 29, Austrians will go to the polls to elect a new government, and it is likely to be a very interesting and also very quite perhaps unpredictable election. For the time being, the outlook is quite grim for the current government, the Green Conservative government, which has suffered lately from a lot of infighting between the coalition partners and is quite likely to lose its majority. And meanwhile, on the other flank, we're seeing the far-right FPÖ surging, likely to overtake the ÖVP possibly as the biggest party in the Austrian parliament and therefore in a position to present the next chancellor. And therefore, this election is also followed quite closely around the European capitals, where many fear that an FPÖ-led government could spell trouble for the European establishment if we sort of get a new EU-skeptic illiberal government across in Central Europe. So what are the prospects for the Austrian election? What would it mean if the FPÖ moves into the chancellery, and what will this election mean for Europe and the EU? To discuss this, I'm very happy to welcome Laurenz Ennser-Jedenastik, professor of Austrian politics at the University of Vienna. So therefore, I mean, the ideal person to discuss the impact of Austrian politics on Europe. Thank you for joining us, Laurenz. Welcome to the webinar.
Thank you.
Now, before we begin the discussion, everyone who's listening in, thank you for being here. And I mean, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions as we move along at the end of the discussion. So while you're listening, I mean, do write down any questions that you may have in the chat, and then we'll get to them towards the end. Good. Laurenz, I would like to start off with the general political situation, sort of the state of play of Austrian politics. Because if we look back 4 or 5 years when this Green Conservative government was formed, a lot of people sort of looked to Austria and said, what a Versuchslabor, what a political experimental laboratory. And this coalition was sort of regarded as a kind of a guinea pig for political coalitions because it combined a conservative party with a green party. And I mean, some commentators saw it as sort of a reference model for the future. Others spoke of a new era of European politics. And if we then look at the situation today, I mean, it is markedly different. The government has suffered significant losses in the European Parliament elections. And I mean, there's quite a bit of a discord between the partners. So my first question is quite bluntly, what in the world happened to this guinea pig coalition? Why, I mean, did the guinea pigs succumb to the experiment?
Yes, thank you. Hello, everybody. I think we have to separate out different aspects when we want to judge the performance of this government. So the government parties will kind of, they will suffer very heavy losses next Sunday. In all likelihood, going from like around 54% or so combined, or 51, 52% combined at the last election to more like 34, 35, maybe. So like they will in total they will suffer, like they will lose like a third of their voters maybe. So that doesn't look quite, that looks bad, right? What we also have to, it's also true that the coalition parties have become really hostile towards each other and really kind of reached, or like have displayed a lot of conflict in the public even. Like, I mean, coalition governments are always like prone to conflict and controversy, and there's infighting, but a lot of that has now spilled into the open. That may be because of the election, but who knows? It's also like 5 years are really a long time to govern together, and for two parties that are very, very ideologically distinct are quite difficult. If we look at the policy record of this government, it's actually, and I think that's what should be like maybe even our most important criterion. I think the policy record of this government is actually not so bad. It's a little difficult to judge because the circumstances were so extraordinary, because the last 5 years included a pandemic and Russia's attack on Ukraine, massive refugee flows coming to Austria and to many other European countries, massive inflation and energy crisis, and also like some Austrian-specific things like a massive corruption scandal involving the larger party in government. So actually, those are very, very extraordinary circumstances. And therefore, it's a little difficult to compare these two, like this government to previous governments. But if you look at the policies that they have implemented over time, and even if you exclude the ones that were just mostly crisis-induced, I think the record is not so bad. We've certainly seen the most pro-environmental government in Austria. We've also seen reforms in other areas, like there were a little more unexpected, like taxes, for instance, and benefits. So one of the biggest tax reforms in the last decades has been passed by this government, kind of out of the blue. It's like a little unexpected. Also, yeah, massive investments in renewable energy, public transport, as a tax on CO2. So on the environmental, I think the environmental agenda is actually like definitely the Greens would have been more ambitious, and a lot of things didn't happen that were announced. But there's definitely like, if you compare it to previous governments, quite a big progress there. Also, other stuff like anti-corruption laws or freedom of information laws. Austria is the last country in the European Union not to have a freedom of information law, and that has now been passed also and will enter into effect next year. So I think on the policy front, you can actually draw a much more positive picture. The election will be like between catastrophic and really bad for these two parties. But given the circumstances, you could also see that I think just like the pandemic, all the difficulties, all the crises are just taking its toll.
So that would be the explanation for why the government at the moment is polling so bad. That's sort of external factors, as it were, like so climate or war and pandemic and so on.
Well, that's part of it, but the biggest drop in loss. So we should say like the ÖVP, the Christian Democratic, the senior party in the coalition, will suffer the much bigger losses. And the biggest loss happened to them when Sebastian Kurz stepped down as a chancellor after like his being involved in this like corruption allegations. That was already in November of 2021. So that's quite a while back. And that basically knocked down the party by 10 points in the polls. And they've basically been in a similar place ever since. So if you think about like, so that was the biggest single event in terms of if you just look at the polls and see what happened. For the Greens, the story is a bit different. I think they just suffer also because they are exposed to a lot more competition on the left side of the party spectrum than used to be the case. So I'm not sure. Of course, there's lots of dissatisfaction with the performance of the government and inflation and asylum policy and COVID. But that is only a part of the story. I think it's also like very specific. So all the crises that happened and are potentially still ongoing are, of course, an explanation for the performance, but I think they're only a partial explanation.
Do you see also a shift of sort of political, or what political themes concern the voters? I mean, if we look back at 2019, we had, of course, this sort of green zeitgeist, as it were, sort of Fridays for Future and a lot of focus on climate policy. And now, I mean, the ambiance anyway has shifted so that other themes seem important. I mean, could you sort of elaborate on what themes are moving sort of the Austrian voters today?
Yeah, I think we've seen a shift from, we started out 5 years ago with like, yeah, the climate issue was quite, I would say was dominant, but it was like very important. One of the top issues, definitely. So that also carried the Greens to great strength, and also like forced all the other parties to kind of accommodate this agenda into their own policies. So what happened then was, of course, then the pandemic hit, and of course then that was the number one issue for a long time, and completely dominated everything, including all the social and economic effects of the pandemic, like job losses and business closures and everything. And Austria had a relatively strong response to the pandemic, in the sense that like many of the policies were quite strict and quite harsh. Austria was also the only country ever to pass a law I think in Europe, without with the exception of the Vatican, the only country ever to pass a vaccine mandate, which was never implemented, but was passed in parliament. So quite harsh lockdowns, quite strict COVID regime, but very variable. So like going from strict to very loose and strict again in a short period. So I think a problem there was the consistency of the policy that was a little erratic. After COVID, of course, whatever after COVID really means, right? But then in February 2022, we've got the Russian invasion, and from that on, we've got, of course, that as a major issue, plus then energy prices and inflation. So we've basically have two periods where there's like one very dominant issue. That was first COVID, and then energy and inflation. And now we've entered a phase of over the last year or so where the issue landscape has become more heterogeneous again, and you can also see this playing out in the campaign. Like inflation is still somewhat important, but it has, of course, as inflation has gone down, the issue has also disappeared a bit. So we now have more a heterogeneous issue landscape. If you look at polls, you see that climate, inflation, migration, the economic situation in general, all those are somewhat important, but there's not one single issue that completely dominates.
Interesting, and because some of the things that I've seen also Austrian media writing about is sort of that climate may come back on the agenda now with the floodings, the terrible floodings that have hit also Vienna and other parts. I've seen Der Standard writing about like Gummistiefel politics, or like rubber boots politics, where sort of this crisis management of the established politicians may sort of help them in the election. I don't know if you could comment on sort of the role that these floodings are playing politically right now.
Yeah, I mean, we know from the past that there have been instances in which politicians have benefited or suffered from floodings or related effects, like their perceived performance in those disaster situations. I think we just don't know. So basically what the floodings did is they stopped the campaign for a week or so. Everything was on hold. Everybody was in like disaster mode. And then kind of the campaign has now picked up again as like the most, like the disastrous situation has dissipated a bit, but it's really unclear. So there's like different possibilities. So one option is like, it doesn't matter at all in terms of the election. Another option is also like you could see that the parties were extremely careful not to overplay the issue and to not like appear to be using it for campaign purposes. So they were relatively restrained and very careful in their public appearances. So one thing could be that, of course, this is a crisis, and a crisis will always produce like attention for the government and the incumbents. So it could benefit the incumbents. Another issue is that it could be pushing the issue of climate change to the forefront of voters' minds. That may benefit the Greens. We have had one or two polls since the floodings really happened, and they don't show much movement. So maybe nothing will happen in terms of effects of the floodings on the election result, and we will only really get a hint of that on election day, because it's just like too soon or too early before the election to tell.
Yeah, makes good sense. I think then it makes good sense then also to try to take a look at the polls. because like if the polls that I looked on this morning, the FPÖ is said to become the largest party, but only with a slight margin, so 27%, followed closely by the conservative ÖVP with 25, and then sort of the Social Democrats polling around 20, and then a couple smaller parties, the NEOS and the Greens around 10, and then a couple smaller parties. If we look at sort of the recent polls that we've seen, not only this morning, but also over the past few weeks, what do you sort of see as the possible coalitions that might emerge? I mean, one of the things that, I mean, if the FPÖ become the largest party, they would sort of have a shot at the chancellery. Is that even a possibility, or will it be some sort of other government around the FPÖ?
So a few things we have to bear in mind when you think about coalitions. The only party that would ever work together with the radical right FPÖ is the ÖVP, so the Conservatives. All other parties have excluded or ruled out working together with the FPÖ. So, but because the FPÖ is the strongest party in the polls and will possibly be the strongest party in the parliament, could be close in the end, but all the polls have had the FPÖ at number 1, even though the margin has like shrunk. If the FPÖ is the largest party, well, it just becomes more difficult to form alternative coalitions. So what does that mean? I think we can summarize it very briefly by either we have a government that includes the FPÖ, that will be an FPÖ-ÖVP or ÖVP-FPÖ government, or we'll have a government that's very internally heterogeneous in terms of party ideology and preferences. So what are the options? Because the ÖVP is the only party willing to govern together with the FPÖ, but has also ruled out working with the FPÖ's current party leader, that complicates things even more. But because the ÖVP is the only party willing to, in theory at least, work together with the FPÖ, their bargaining position is usually very strong because they have more options than all the other parties. There hasn't been a majority to the left of the ÖVP, the Conservatives, in Austrian politics for almost 40 years. And it's unlikely that we'll have one this time. It could be close, but it doesn't look like that at the moment. So usually you have a center-right majority in the Austrian parliament. And that means any ideas about like a left-wing plus liberal parties coalition is just unfeasible because the numbers do not add up. So that leaves a coalition of the Conservatives plus Social Democrats plus maybe a third party if needed for the majority, which could be the case. So in that case, they will probably go for the smaller liberal NEOS party rather than the Greens, which I think the ÖVP are a bit fed up with. But who knows? So I think we'll have either an FPÖ-ÖVP coalition, but we shall talk about that separately, or a coalition that's kind of like a kind of grand coalition plus sort of thing across the ideological divide, left-right. If we haven't, the thing about the FPÖ getting into government is, so the tradition is, so the rule is that Austria has an elected president, and the president appoints the chancellor. The president usually also nominates somebody to form a government, but that's just a norm. That's not a constitutional requirement. So the president will usually, after a few days after the election, maybe 1 or 2 weeks after the election, go to some of the party leaders. Usually it's the strongest party and their leader, and ask them to form a government or to try and form a government. If the FPÖ is the strongest party, the president has already indicated that it may not be automatically them who will get this task, or who he will ask to perform this task. So we don't know. I think what we always need to remember is that Austrian parties are very office-oriented. That means they prioritize government participation above everything else. And that means, especially for the ÖVP, the current #1 party in government, the current chancellor party, they would like to keep their number one spot in government. If they're only the second party in the election, they can still achieve this by forming this more heterogeneous coalition with the Social Democrats and the smaller party. And I think they would prefer this over being the junior partner for the FPÖ. I think that's also why they have ruled out working with the FPÖ party leader, because they want to kind of prepare the ground for this argument that, like, we're not the largest party, but we've ruled out this larger party, or their leader at least, and so we can collaborate with other parties. And so we're just sticking to what we said before the election. If the ÖVP, by surprise, overtakes the FPÖ, so sorry, I should finish this. So the short, basically the long story short is, paradoxically, the FPÖ's chances of being in government are larger if they're not the strongest party, because they are more attractive as a junior partner to the Conservatives than as the leading party in government, with the Conservatives joining as a junior partner. And that's because the Conservatives will hold the balance of power in.
Okay, yeah, that it makes good sense. I mean, paradoxical as it may sound, it makes good sense in the sense of how you sort of describe it. It's interesting that you mentioned Van der Bellen. That's one of the things, or the Bundespräsident. That's one of the things that I wanted to ask about. I mean, if he were, as you described, to not nominate the FPÖ, could you just briefly sort of, what kind of reactions would that entail if he sort of breaks with this democratic tradition of pointing to the largest party?
Yeah, I mean, the FPÖ will of course protest this, but the president is directly elected by a majority of the voters and has complete freedom by the constitution to do this. And I think that's what the argument will be. It of course ignores the tradition of, like, 70 plus years, presidents always asking the leader of the strongest party to make the first attempt at forming a government. We have some polling on this, and that shows that people are largely fine with that. So people want their preferred parties to be in government. And I think if that means you ignore the largest party and just ask the second largest party to make the first move at government formation attempts, then most people are fine. The group of people who really, really don't want to see the FPÖ in government is probably a bit larger than the people who vote for the FPÖ. So, of course, it will be controversial in some sense, but it's absolutely within the constitutional. So the constitution doesn't make any requirements of the president. The president could, like, appoint their neighbor or the best friend or whoever, or some random person from the street to be the chancellor. So the president has complete freedom. But of course, it's a break with tradition. And the question is whether the president will want to do this right away. I think one thing that the president may want to do is not to ask anybody formally, but just to ask the parties to talk to each other, which is also a tradition that past presidents have followed. Like, ask the parties to sit together, also report to the president about their talks, and sound out what kind of options there are. And only when it becomes visible or becomes clearer what kind of what the feasible alternatives really are, then to ask somebody to negotiate a government. But so the president could play it slow. I think that's a likely outcome, especially if the FPÖ comes in first and it's not obvious. Because if everybody sticks to their word, the FPÖ have said they will not ever bargain away the role of their party leader in the government, and the ÖVP have said they're not going to work with the leader. So if everybody sticks to their word, that is not a feasible coalition. So somebody has to give in some sense, and that's probably easier if the FPÖ is second. And I think even though the president is not a friend of the FPÖ party leader, he would accept the party being the junior partner in government, but I think he would try and work towards a government that would not be led by the FPÖ.
Right. Yeah, makes good sense. And we'll get back to the FPÖ in a moment, but I want to start off with this sort of Grand Coalition Plus, this kind of mega GroKo. I mean, because as far as I've read, a coalition of this composition and also that size would kind of be a novelty in Austrian politics. And I mean, we've had a similar novelty just across the border in Germany with the three-party government, which has been less than well functioning, to put it mildly. I don't know if, I mean, what might we expect from sort of this kind of three-party heterogeneous government that you've described?
Yeah, it's a good question. So if we have something like that, conservatives plus social democrats plus liberals, that's, I think, the more likely version of this three-way coalition. That would be a novelty. We've never had a three-way coalition since at least like there was a brief one from 1945 that also included the Communist Party then, but that was basically a government of national unity after the war. But since then, all the coalitions have been two-party coalitions. So three-party is a bit more complex, but like three-party coalitions exist in all kinds of places in Europe. So there's nothing problematic about that per se. It's just a thing that people need to get used to. But politicians are quite flexible and deal with all kinds of new situations, especially if it means that they will hold power. So I wouldn't worry about that too much. It will make the internal workings of the government more difficult. But the main difficulty is not that there's like three instead of two parties. It's the fact that the three parties are quite different and have a very different programmatic outlook. So I think that's what would be the main problem. The grand coalition that has governed Austria for such a long time, between 45 and today, for like decades and decades, large parts of the post-war period, I think that would kind of be revived plus a smaller party. And that grand coalition has now, like, the reputation of that is one of, at least from the more recent past, one of gridlock and not much happening other than parties fighting. I'm always a little skeptical because I think if parties do stuff, then they will necessarily fight. And I think there's just like, the current government was also extremely heterogeneous ideologically. So two very, very different parties with two very different ideological positions working together. That was also very conflict laden, but it still meant that they could do stuff. So the question is the conflict that we will see basically a conflict for? So any government like that will be controversial internally and will produce conflict. But the question is the conflict basically the outcome of the substantive work of the government? Or is the conflict a conflict for the sake of conflict? And I think that's an open question. We know that in the past, these grand coalition governments have had elements of like mutual sabotage and infighting that were not grounded in any policy controversy, but just in like mutual dislike more. And I think that's also a potential danger or risk now, especially because the parties are probably ideologically even further apart than they used to be in the past.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, there's been in Germany, I mean, there's been talk about sort of the German vote that in the EU, that often because the government is so, I mean, there's so much discord between the parties, it's difficult to find a position on certain pieces of EU legislation, and they abstain, which means no, and then it becomes more and more difficult to adopt legislation in the EU. So, but you're saying, I mean, this three-party government could produce sort of an Austrian vote also in that sense, where Austria becomes sort of a more, how do you say, unpredictable partner, or is it just, should we just get used to more discord in government?
I mean, in the past, the conflicts that, or like the fighting that we've seen was more on domestic matters rather than on like voting in the council, for instance. We've now had a massive row between the current coalition parties about the naturalization, or not like the nature restoration directive. And I think so that was the first one that really broke out into the open, where European issues were concerned. Like maybe not the first one, it was also like Schengen things. So that, yeah, I think but I would always think that the discord like about voting behavior in the council, or what initiatives like Austria should support or follow at the European level, are usually they're just an extension of domestic conflict. So that's how I think about them. But because of course many issues that are domestically controversial are regulated at the European level, it's just like that conflict is also extended to the European level. And I think it could be that we'll have, especially now that I think the institutional problem has also come to the fore, that the institutional setup for coordinating coalition parties to have like a uniform position in the European institutions is not well, I don't know, well outlined, or like the laws that govern this process are not like very specific about what needs to happen when. So, and also in the past Austrian governments have been a little more like, let's say, have treated this like with some, taken a lot of freedom, like in maybe just not following the exact procedures here. So I think we could definitely see also like more discord and greater difficulties in forming a consistent position at the European level if we had such a heterogeneous government, especially because the three parties also have quite a different outlook about what the shape of the European Union should be in the future, what should be the direction of travel for the European project. Those are quite different ideas. So you could always see an area for compromise, especially if there's no, especially on things that are more day-to-day affairs. But of course, if it's about the bigger questions about like what should the European Union look like in 10 or 20 years? What about like enlargement questions, or maybe even reforms to the treaties, which seems unlikely, but who knows? Then I think conflict is more likely.
Right. Okay. I reckon. I mean, even if you say that the FPÖ doesn't necessarily or wouldn't be able to present the chancellor, I think we have to play the scenario through anyway, just for the sake of it. So I mean, the basic question is, I mean, what would happen if they did secure the chancellery? I mean, there's been a lot of talk about sort of, I think it was Jarosław Kaczynski in Poland who used to say that he wanted to create a Budapest on the Vistula. So my question is basically like, if the FPÖ gets into government, could we see like similar sort of attacks on the rule of law institutions? I mean, could we see sort of a Budapest in the Alps, if you know if you understand the question?
Yes, yeah. Budapest is already on the Danube, so that metaphor really does. Yeah. I'm a little hesitant because I'm not sure so there's like the chances of an FPÖ-led government are like not super high, but then definitely not zero. So that's absolutely something that could happen, right? Especially if all other alternatives prove to not be viable. So I'm a little hesitant to think that this would be very, very different, especially because the two parties would be similarly strong in parliament. So I'm a little hesitant to think that this would be very, very different than past governments between the ÖVP and the FPÖ, which have existed, which have happened like 3 times at least. Because the role of the chancellor in Austrian politics is not institutionally extremely strong. So the chancellor is basically the president of the ministers' council, but the chancellor has no powers of direction vis-a-vis individual ministers. The chancellor is basically just the head of the government, but has no elevated role constitutionally vis-a-vis the other members of government. So per se, the role of the chancellor, or the power of the chancellor, is because they are the person leading the strongest party in government usually, and they are also the most visible face of the government. But those are not like hard powers; those are more soft powers. So I think if we think about what a government under the leadership of the FPÖ would do, I think it would look not too dissimilar from like the first Sebastian Kurz government. Also like a coalition of the ÖVP and the FPÖ, just the ÖVP was the somewhat stronger party. Of course, there are issues where we could expect that there will be attacks on certain liberties and also democratic institutions, or like institutions that are at least maybe not core institutions of the state, but are like part of a functioning democratic society. So the target number one, I think, is the public broadcaster, the ORF, which is basically hostile territory for the FPÖ, or the FPÖ basically have singled out the ORF as one of their main enemies, kind of. And I think we should probably expect attempts to weaken the ORF, cut the ORF's funding, or further politicize the ORF in a sense, in a way that would be beneficial to the FPÖ. The ORF is already quite politicized, especially in like who gets to be the director general, and who gets to hand out positions and everything. But the reporting is relatively neutral and fact-based. So we haven't seen that there's a politicization at the organization level, but not at the kind of editorial level, or actually the programming. So, or at least like that's very, if you like, national level news, especially, it's quite well isolated, and we could see attempts to actually change that. Whether that's going to be successful, I'm not sure. There's actually a decision by the Constitutional Court that requires the organizational makeup of the ORF to be changed in a way that will isolate it even more from political influence. That will need to happen in the next few months or so. So there's like, the room to do that is actually not limitless. So there's limits to that. There's also other constraints. Much of the things that the FPÖ wants to do are really constrained by constitutional law, European law, or international treaties. So for instance, cutting benefits for immigrants, or like treating citizens differently based on whether they have citizenship from birth or from like naturalization. All this, like they've attempted this in the past, also in the first Kurz government, and that has largely failed, and was usually, these attempts were usually killed by the Constitutional Court, the European Court of Justice, or the European Court of Human Rights. So there are real constraints, and what I think we would expect from an FPÖ-led government is that they will try and push against these constraints as much as they can. So we will probably see things that will end up in the courts, and usually the courts have won in the past, right? So these institutional constraints have done the job that they are supposed to do, and I would expect that this will also be the case in the future. I couldn't see how the FPÖ will undermine the European Court of Justice or even the Constitutional Court in Austria to kind of remove these constraints. But of course, you can do stuff within the constraints of constitutional and European law that would be maybe seen as dangerous or problematic. We could definitely see stuff like rolling back some of the climate legislation that past governments have passed. We could also see, of course, like in terms of economic policy would turn to the right, with the FPÖ and the ÖVP agreeing on a lot of things, cutting taxes for businesses, cutting taxes in general, maybe reducing, but of course, like the budget is in really dire straits, so it's hard to see how everything should be paid for that these parties are promising. But I would expect also, like, of course, heavy like attempts to cut the number of asylum seekers coming to Austria, similar to what the Dutch are doing and the Germans are trying to do. So along those lines, like closing down borders. Again, then we're pushing against the constraints of European law, and we'll see the outcomes of those. But those are similar, probably would be similar developments to what happens in other countries. So I find it difficult, given the constraints of a coalition partner, the strong constitutional court, strong European regulations. I find it very difficult to see how you could do what Orban has done with a basically 2/3 majority in parliament, which this government will not have, So I think that just the possibilities are more limited in that case. But of course, there could be things like, especially in the treatment of the media, treatment of civil society organizations. The FPÖ have said they want to register all kinds of civil society organizations, NGOs, and demand more transparency about their funding sources and everything. We know all these kinds of laws from Russia and from Hungary and places. So there could definitely be attempts to undermine the functioning of civil society, media, and some democratic institutions. And those will be the most crucial parts to watch, but I'm relatively optimistic about the strength of some of these institutions.
Remember, if you have some questions, please do put them in the chat, and then we'll attempt to get them here towards the end. But there is one thing that I have to ask you also, which I think is very interesting. Now that we're touching sort of on themes, because if we look at the sort of current EU agenda on economic policy, I mean, there's been a lot seems to indicate that we need a lot of money. And I mean, von der Leyen wants to create sort of an investment commission and invest a lot of money in all kinds of areas. And I mean, this is an area where Denmark and Austria traditionally have shared a lot of interests, both having been so-called frugal countries. So, but the Danish government has actually moved here and has sort of opened towards the possibility of also using, for instance, state subsidies to support industry, to support green transition, and so on. Regardless of what government might now come in Austria, I mean, have there been sort of a similar positioning of in Austria towards these issues, towards sort of a more, greater spending, as it were?
Yes, I mean, it's a tricky situation because the budget deficit is quite high and likely to exceed the Maastricht threshold. But in principle, I think there is a very strong urge, especially on the part of the Conservatives, but also other parties have endorsed this view that we need to do stuff to support Austrian industry, especially so manufacturing. And one reason for that is that inflation was really bad in Austria, worse than in most other EU countries, and wage rises, therefore, because Austria still has this very strong system of corporatism, where wage rises basically are never below inflation. So we've had wage rises of like 9-10% in the last 2 years, which is good for purchasing powers, but it means that businesses that are export-oriented are at a competitive disadvantage now. If you have to pay your workers 10% more, and your competitors abroad will only have to pay them like 4 or 5% more, then this just puts you in a really difficult situation. And I think people have recognized this, and this is at the top of the agenda. So people have become more friendly towards some. I mean, Austria has never been ideologically pro-market or anything, right? Not even the Conservatives. They've always been pro-business, but not necessarily pro-market. So meddling in the market to support manufacturing and businesses is totally a thing that they would do. So I would also expect that there would be support measures for industry, and they would also support European level measures to support manufacturing businesses. But we'll see. There's only so much you can do. Of course, there's also European law constraints about state subsidies and stuff like that. But definitely, I think any government will have to address this issue to some extent, because just Austrian wage policies means that competitiveness of export-oriented businesses is suffering in times of high inflation.
We have a question in the chat.
Yes.
Would it be possible? Can you talk about the ÖVP's refusal to work with the leader of FPÖ? What are the options if he doesn't want to step down?
Yes, good question. I don't know. I mean, as I said, if everybody sticks to their word, then this will not happen. So there's all kinds of rumors and ideas spreading around about but could we maybe give the leader some other job, maybe be the president of parliament or something? I find it really difficult to envisage what's going to happen, but maybe that's just my lack of imagination. One thing we have to know is that the FPÖ have done this in the past. The FPÖ in the year 2000, when Schüssel and Haider formed the first ÖVP-FPÖ coalition, that was so critically perceived in the European Union. It was basically a condition of the ÖVP that that Haider not be included in the government. And the lesson for the FPÖ was, don't ever do this again. Like, don't ever leave basically your party leader and your spiritual leader, in a sense, out of the government, because it will just produce conflict, because you've got your power center that's not in the government, really, right? So I think they really, really don't want to do this. So the FPÖ has really, really learned the lesson of not ever giving an honest question whether their party leader should be represented in government. And it's also outside of it's usually not the case that coalition parties kind of dictate the personnel of the other party in a government. So one thing is that the ÖVP could just give in and say yeah, well, if there's no other option, then we'll just do it, and we'll basically find a way of working with Kickl. But they've really dug their heels in quite substantially. So it would be a massive backtrack that would be required. All of this is easier to do if the ÖVP is actually ahead of the FPÖ, because then Kickl will not be chancellor. Maybe then he'll even be happy to stay in parliament, be the party group leader or the president of parliament or whatever. But much more difficult to do if the FPÖ is the #1 party, because Kickl has been so vocal in claiming the position of the chancellor for himself in the case that the FPÖ leads the coalition, that anything other than that would be very, very difficult to portray or to argue for in the public. So it's a tricky situation. And I think if some of these parties, if one of these parties gives in, it will not happen right away, but it will take a long time. So
sort of to sum up, I mean, difficult, complex time ahead, but also very interesting times, I think, in Austrian politics. We're over time. Thank you for joining, Laurenz. It was a great pleasure to hear your thoughts and insights on the Austrian election, and I'm sure that the people who've participated here have also enjoyed it. I mean, I found it very interesting, at least. So thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the day. And I mean, good luck on Sunday.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for attending this. Thanks for having me, and we'll see what happens.
See what happens. Take care.
Cool.
Bye. Thank
Goodbye.
you all. Bye.